Hello and welcome to this first chapter of the podcast, The Battle of Fornovo, 1495, Renaissance Italy, the Italian Wars. My name is Victus and I am your host. Be my guest and let us dive into the Renaissance and the battle that started it all, the Battle of Fornovo. We're going to begin with the intentions of the French monarch to do what he did. What was the reasoning behind the whole deal? What are the forces that the Italians are dealing with? What is the political environment of the region and how much territory the King of France is going to gain during the first months of the invasion? For the beginnings of this explanation, we're going to go before 1495, and this is at the beginning of the invasion in August 1494. One must understand that the state of France was a very powerful entity in the region. For the purposes of this podcast, I'm going to refer to the kingdoms in the majority of the cases as states. If the political entity is not a kingdom, then it is a republic, and thus I'm going to refer to it as a city-state. These for the patchwork of entities existing in the Italian peninsula during this period. The state of France has just ended the struggle that it had with the English, the 100 Years' War. Not so long ago, parting from the beginnings of the Italian campaign. The Spaniards, or more likely Columbus, have recently discovered peoples in the Caribbean, and there is a lot of awareness of the size of the earth thanks to the Portuguese cartographers coming to Europe with a lot of information on their voyages. So France is now being victorious over the English, and their morale is now boosted because of that fact. Plenty of soldiers that fought during the so long years of the war are now anxious and craving the feeling of conflict. France was accustomed to wage war. Young Charles VIII is trying to show his subjects that he can achieve glory and is trying to find a way to get exactly that. He's searching some sort of importance and testing how powerful he could become with such a military might that he has in his hands. He finds in his claim of the Kingdom of Naples an excuse to invade. He had this concept of the world in which chivalry is still alive and the precepts of the code can still be achieved, something that is going to be proven the opposite during the developments of warfare of the military revolution that is taking place in his times. In addition, this man is about to send the Western world into a spiraling cycle of war and violence that will shatter the Italians to the very core. Then, as mentioned before, and according to the sources, Charles VIII was very interested in the chivalry deeds, and he wanted to emulate the stories of bravery and glory. So that we have understood about the character of the king. The claim of Naples is his excuse, so he got one. And his motivation is going to become the idea to be the liberator of the East by the Turkish menace. The Turkish threat of the Ottoman Empire was something that was felt in the eastern regions for many years during the medieval times, and now we see a young ambitious king willing to take back again the crusades to the Turks and roll back the Islam from the eastern provinces. We find ourselves in the threshold of the medieval era and the early modern times. Now, you see, the Italian fragmentation of the peninsula in terms of government is perhaps one of the most interesting things that happened in the area, and allowed several kingdoms to behave aggressively before that very situation, and thus take advantage in most of the cases by the fact that politically the Italian peninsula was not a single entity. In one hand, we have a power on Italy, which is the papacy, that is very aware of the growing power of the neighboring kingdom of the Aragonese, the Kingdom of Naples. This is perhaps the gate for the invitation, in which several city-states are now in a position to accept the invasion, and perhaps not to create a permanent state for the new power, but just to bring the might of France as a help for the actual enmity that have developed in Italy. The invasion of the foreign power had advantages for the papacy in the fact that the actual forces of Charles were focused on the Kingdom of Naples, and Milan was clearly an ally. Florence had no objections, but that will not stay the same throughout the conflict, as we'll discover. There was before a treaty, the so-called Peace of Lodi, that stated that all Italian city-states would reduce the size of their armies, being Firenze the only one that respected the treaty. In this moment, it is good to get into the realization that the Italian entities were very sophisticated and wealthier than many other regions in Europe of the time. Many figures were capable of raising their own and private armies, the so-called condottieros, and become a force to be reckoned with. The fact that all these polities were able to create a lot of complex political maneuvers was a proof that Italy was nothing but very well connected in terms of diplomacy. Thus, we have Venezia, that is a very powerful republic that has control over all of the surrounding seas, the Adriatic and, in sort of a way, the Tyrrhenian. With a powerful and considerable fleet of war galleys, this republic was neutral. A remarkable entity indeed. It is good to try to see the situation and understand the fears of certain entities in this manner. This is pretty much the political atmosphere during these previous moments before the invasion. Now let's move to the region of Asti in the north of Italy. A French advance force enters northwestern Italy, exactly directed to Asti. They were joined by the Milanese troops. In here I'm going to point out the forces that were involved in this first incursion. Let us know that Papal Aragonese troops clashed with this force in Ferrara. In this aspect, we have the following amount of individuals that were participating in this skirmish. With the Franco-Milanese force, we have 300 infantry crossbowmen and 500 mounted crossbowmen. Up to this point, we see the actual emphasis that is made on the crossbow unit. The crossbow was still an important weapon used in the actual region. 200 Scots, a very interesting note, and 300 Swiss pikemen, the Landsknechts mercenaries. This is in the French section. With the Milanese, we have 300 noble men-at-arms potentially, 2,000 infantry troops not specified of which type, and 1,200 heavy cavalry around Ferrara. So this sums up, at this point, 1,500 heavy knights and 2,000 infantry for the Milanese French incursion. A very equal ratio in between cavalry and infantry to be noted. At the same time that this is happening, the Duke of Orléans is taking a fleet from Marseille to Genoese ports. Genoa was politically controlled by Milan by this time. Charles is now heading for Turin, and this is at the beginning of the campaign in August. If we remember, the Pope was very aware of the growing power of the Aragonese in Naples, but in this case, he is actually allying himself with them. Because for the Pope, the actual major threat was coming from the north in the form and shape of King Charles VIII. These volatile diplomatic changes of alliances are going to characterize the city-states of Italy and the Renaissance politics overall, a very delicate diplomatic situation and a common denominator. The Duke of Orleans is going to take the ports of Genoa very quickly, being them controlled by the allied Milanese. The Pope is going to send Aragonese fleets and seize the port of Rapallo, slightly south of Genoa. The port of Rapallo is a very important topic in here because this is where one of the first massacres is going to occur and become a sort of recurring rule in this type of warfare. At this point, the Duke d'Orléans is sending war galleys and a contingent from the Milanese are approaching from the north, thus trapping the poor Aragonese garrison inside Rapallo. They are doing this with a lot of precision, predominantly using the Swiss mercenaries. These Landsknechts were encamped in Ferrara with the advance force that reached Asti at the beginning. These pikemen are going to commit a horrific massacre in Rapallo, the first of many committed by Landsknechts during the Italian wars of the Renaissance. German-Swiss Landsknechts were not interested in the slightest on the chivalric code of conduct, so they are not giving a heck on these matters. There's nothing that these mercenaries could care less than the life of nobles and the life of war captives. Profit is their own interest. In the meantime, Charles is crossing the Alps with a mighty army. The Savoyards are going to surrender, some sources say, but more likely than surrender, I would say they are going to open the gates and enable the foreigners to move through the land without opposition, which is something completely different. Charles and Louis, the Duc d'Orléans, are now consolidating all of their forces in Asti, which is going to be held as a foothold and the new French base of operations in Italy, a region with a lot of importance that will have a lot of impact in the actual campaign. The French thus are going to throw themselves southwards to Pavia and leave in Asti a small force commanded by the Duke d'Orléans. The Italians are now realizing that this is a very well-planned invasion. Now it's clear that the French are here to conquer. It is the region of the west, the coast, that the actual Italian city-states are going to concentrate their defenses. So pretty much the expected route that the invasion is going to take is going to be the eastern side. Let's contemplate that the Florentines were supporters of the French at the beginning. Then they simply could not accept the idea of the invasion. Why this change? One could simply imagine and remember that part of the Treaty of Lodi demanded the reduction in army size, and the Florentines were actually the only ones that were obeying this normative. And it is not surprisingly noted here that this was the reason they fell so quickly during the offensive of the French. With all of this interesting story, I have forgotten to mention the name of the commander leading the Papal Aragonese forces to defend Italy. Niccolo Orsini is pretty much the condottiero in command from the first stages of the invasion. Now, we know that the King Charles is reaching Pavia, and Louis d'Orléans is with a garrison in Asti. Charles is very close to Tuscany, and at this point, Charles VIII has managed to increase his mercenaries and is able to enlist around 4,000 Landsknechts and 3,000 infantry crossbowmen, plus 1,500 men-at-arms, which are knights, a force around 9,000 or perhaps even achieving the 10,000 with the baggage train included. To To imagine the resources that he is using in this endeavor is pretty much the moment in which you realize how powerful is this kingdom. The situation is getting a little bit difficult for the defenders. In between 2 months, the forces of Charles are now reaching Siena, forcing a withdrawal from Orsini to Naples, and the Pope is forced to recall his own men to the defense of Rome. Now is the moment in which Rome finds herself in more peril and at risk than ever before. The Pope is frightened. The fleet of the French continues to take city by city on the coastline, including Ostia, and ports belonging to Florence are now given to France, allowing the French to resupply with ease. By this time, basically the only thing that is going to separate the King of France and Naples is going to be pretty much Rome. The Pope is now sending envoys to come to terms with the invaders. It is clear that he is about to lose his power. We have reached the end of the very first podcast chapter that I have decided to create. I want to let you know that I'm using predominantly 2 sources to get this podcast done. Fornovo 1495 by Osprey Publishing and The Prince by Niccolo Machiavelli, a book that is one of my everlasting recommendations. In the next chapter, we're going to see how King Charles VIII manages to reach Naples and how he managed to achieve what he achieved, and getting thus closer to the Battle of Fornovo. Thank you for your company up to this point. This has been a pleasure. You've listened to Victus podcast on the Battle of Fornovo 1495, Renaissance Italy, the Italian Wars.